The wallet was ordinary in the way that the possessions of extraordinary people are sometimes ordinary. A dark leather bifold that had been carried long enough to show the specific wear that comes from daily use. The corners softened, the leather at the fold slightly paler than the rest from the accumulated friction of being opened and closed thousands of times. It contained what wallets contain: cards and cash, and the compressed material evidence of a life organized enough to carry identification and disorganized enough to accumulate the small receipts and membership cards and folded notes that fill the unused compartments of wallets that belong to people who are too busy to empty them regularly. It did not look like something that belonged to one of the most famous athletes in the world. It looked like something that belonged to a person, which is what it was, and which is the detail that matters most in understanding what happened after it was lost. Kobe Bryant lost the wallet on a Wednesday afternoon in November 2003, somewhere between the parking structure of a shopping center in Marina del Rey and the entrance of the restaurant where he had agreed to meet a friend for lunch. This was the reconstruction that emerged afterward, pieced together from the sequence of events rather than from direct observation, because nobody saw the wallet fall and nobody saw it on the ground in the interval between when it left his pocket and when the man who found it picked it up. The interval was probably short. The wallet was found near the third row of the parking structure at a time that suggested it had been there for less than 20 minutes, which is a short enough window in a busy parking structure that the person who found it could reasonably conclude that the owner was still somewhere nearby, still in the building, still findable if the finder decided that finding the owner was what the situation required. The man who found it was named Robert Yates. He was 53 years old and he had been without a permanent address for 14 months, living in a rotation of shelters and transitional spaces, and on the nights when the shelters were full or the rules of the available shelter conflicted with the specific circumstances of his situation, in the parking structures and covered spaces that Los Angeles provides to those who know where to look. He had been, before the 14 months, a mid-level logistics manager for a distribution company in Torrance that had restructured in the way that companies restructure when the market moves faster than their organizational models, which is to say suddenly and with consequences that were distributed unequally among the people whose professional identities were organized around its continued existence. He had been married. He had a daughter in her mid-20s who lived in Phoenix and with whom the relationship had the specific complexity that relationships develop when a parent's life moves in directions that a child cannot fully help with, and that the distance between Phoenix and Los Angeles makes harder to navigate than proximity might have allowed. Robert had been walking through the parking structure on his way to the supermarket at the shopping center's ground level, a supermarket where he had established over several months the kind of peripheral relationship with certain employees that people in his situation develop with the places they pass through regularly, not friendship exactly, but a mutual acknowledgement that contains within it an implicit agreement about how the space will be shared. He saw the wallet on the ground near a dark SUV, and he picked it up and he opened it in the way you open a found wallet, not to examine the contents with any intention other than identifying who it belonged to. And the first card he encountered was a credit card, and the name on the credit card was a name that required a moment to process, because the name on the credit card was not the name of a private person having an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, but was the name that in November 2003 was on the front page of sports sections and entertainment sections and news sections, with a frequency that made it one of the most recognized names in the country. He stood in the parking structure with the wallet in his hands and did the calculation that anyone would do in that situation, the rapid inventory of options and their implications. He could keep the wallet, which contained enough cash that keeping it would have made a specific and immediate difference to the material conditions of his next several days. He could turn it into the shopping center's management office, which would ensure it reached its owner eventually, but would involve an interaction with an institutional setting that people in Robert's situation navigate with the particular caution that experience teaches. Or he could find the owner directly, which would require staying in the area long enough to identify which of the people moving through the parking structure was the name on the credit card, and then doing the thing that the situation, if he was being honest with himself about what the situation required, clearly required. He stayed. He positioned himself near the entrance of the parking structure, where he could see the people coming and going without being conspicuous, which was something he had become good at over 14 months of living in spaces that were not designed for him. the ability to be present without drawing the kind of attention that leads to being moved along. He waited for 40 minutes. The wallet stayed in his jacket pocket, and the cash in the wallet stayed in the wallet, and Robert Yates stood near the entrance of a parking structure in Marina del Rey on a Wednesday afternoon in November 2003 and waited for the person whose name was on the credit card to come back to his car. Kobe Bryant had realized the wallet was missing at the table in the restaurant when the check arrived, and he reached into his jacket pocket and found the pocket empty. He retraced his steps in the way you retrace steps when something important is missing, with the specific focus of someone running backward through the previous 30 minutes, looking for the frame where the thing was present and the frame where it was not. He excused himself from lunch and walked back through the restaurant and out into the shopping center and toward the parking structure. And he was moving with the purpose of someone who has decided that finding what was lost is possible if the search is thorough enough, which is how Kobe Bryant moved through most problems. Robert saw him before he saw Robert. He recognized him from the photographs that had been everywhere that fall, and he stepped forward from the entrance where he had been standing and said, in the direct way of someone who has prepared what they are going to say and is saying it without ornament, "I think I have something that belongs to you." Kobe stopped. He looked at Robert with the attention he gave to situations that needed to be read, and he took the wallet that Robert was extending toward him and confirmed that it was his, and then he did something that Robert described years later as the thing that determined everything that followed. He did not immediately open the wallet to check whether the contents were intact. He put the wallet in his pocket and looked at Robert and said, "How long have you been waiting here?" Robert said, "About 40 minutes. Kobe said nothing for a moment, the kind of nothing that has weight, that is doing work even though it contains no words. Then he said, "Come with me." They walked back through the shopping center together and into the restaurant, and Kobe told his friend he would explain later, and he sat down with Robert at a table near the window and he ordered food, and he asked Robert if he was hungry, and Robert said yes, in the way that people say yes, when yes is an understatement that the situation does not permit to be corrected. They ate and they talked, and what passed between them in the next hour was described by Robert, in the account he gave years later, as the most normal conversation he had had in 14 months, which is a description that contains within it everything that needed to be said about what 14 months of the life he had been living had actually consisted of. Kobe asked questions and Robert answered them, and Kobe asked more questions, and the questions were the kind that communicate genuine interest as opposed to the performed interest of someone who is being charitable, in the way that famous people are sometimes charitable, as a transaction, as a form of public kindness that benefits both parties in ways that have nothing to do with the person being helped. Robert told him about the logistics job and the restructuring and the apartment that had followed the job loss, with the inevitability of dominoes arranged in sequence, each fall producing the next. He told him about the marriage that had not survived the combination of financial collapse and the specific pressure that financial collapse puts on the architecture of a relationship that was not built to withstand it. He told him about his daughter in Phoenix and the phone calls that were less frequent than he wanted and more difficult than he knew how to fix. He told him these things not in the shape of a complaint or in the shape of a request, but in the shape of an honest answer to the honest questions of someone who was listening with the full attention that honest questions deserve. And Kobe listened in the way that Robert had described, with the totality of someone for whom listening is not the pause between talking, but is itself the activity. At the end of the hour, Kobe asked Robert what he had been doing to find work, and Robert described the specific obstacles that job searching from a position of homelessness produces, the requirement of a permanent address on applications, the difficulty of maintaining the professional presentation that interviews require when the resources for that presentation are unavailable, the gap in employment history that the 14 months had created and that every application form required him to account for in ways that he had not yet found a satisfactory method of accounting for. He described these things with the practical specificity of someone who had spent 14 months in direct contact with the operational details of the problem and understood them with the precision that proximity provides. Kobe took out his phone and made a call that lasted 4 minutes. Robert could hear one side of the conversation, and what he heard was a man speaking to another man about a specific opening in a specific company's operations division, speaking with the authority of someone who is not asking a favor, but is identifying an alignment between a need and a capability and making the connection that the alignment requires. He said Robert's name, and he said logistics, and he said 14 years experience, and he said, "I'm going to send you his information," and he ended the call and looked at Robert and said, "Someone is going to contact you by the end of the week." He wrote a number on a card and gave it to Robert and said, "If you don't hear from them by Friday, call this number and tell them I said to call you back today." Then he asked about the housing situation, and Robert explained the shelter rotation and the waiting lists and the specific inefficiencies of the transitional housing system that people who have navigated it understand from the inside, in ways that people who have not navigated it understand only in general terms. Kobe listened, and then made a second call that was shorter than the first, and that involved a name that Robert recognized as the name of a foundation he had seen mentioned in a news article. And Kobe said he had someone who needed transitional housing support, and he said he wanted it expedited, and he said he would cover whatever the foundation's involvement required, and he ended the call and said someone from this organization will contact you tomorrow morning. He wrote the organization's name on another card and gave it to Robert and said if they don't call by 10, call this number. Robert Yates sat across from Kobe Bryant in a restaurant in Marina del Rey in November 2003 and said something that Kobe returned to in a private conversation years later with a person who eventually made the story public with Robert's permission. Robert said, "I didn't return the wallet because I thought something like this was going to happen. I returned it because it was the right thing, and because I still needed to be someone who does the right thing. The returning was the last thing I had that told me I was still that person." Kobe was quiet for a long time after that sentence. Not the quiet of someone searching for a response, but the quiet of someone receiving something that does not require a response because the response would diminish it by arriving too quickly. Then he said, "I know. That's why we're sitting here." The phone call came the next morning at 9:40. The logistics position was real, was available, was in a company in the South Bay that specialized in distribution operations, and the person who called had been told by whoever Kobe had spoken to that this candidate was to be given a real interview for a real position, and not the courtesy interview that connections sometimes produce when the connection is more important than the candidate. Robert interviewed on Friday. He was offered the position the following Monday. The transitional housing placement came through on Thursday of that same week, a furnished room in a program in Culver City that provided the address that the employment application required, and the stability that the employment required, and the space in which a person who had been surviving for 14 months could begin the different and more sustainable project of living. He called his daughter in Phoenix from the room in Culver City on the first night. It was the first call he had made to her in 3 months, and the first call in longer than that, where what he had to say included things that were moving forward, rather than only things that were staying still or moving backward. She cried in the way that adult children cry when a parent who has been in a difficult place begins to emerge from it, with the relief of someone who has been holding something heavy and is being told they can set it down. He cried too. The conversation lasted 2 hours, and at the end of it she said she was coming to visit in the spring, and he said he would have a place to have her by then, and he was right. Robert worked at the logistics company for 6 years. He was promoted twice. He moved out of the transitional housing into an apartment in Hawthorne, and then into a better apartment, and eventually into a small house that he rented with the stability of someone whose financial life had been rebuilt on the foundation that a returned wallet and a Wednesday afternoon and 2 phone calls had made possible. He called the number on the card once, in the second week, not to ask for anything but to say that the position had been offered and accepted, and that he wanted the person who had made the calls to know that the calls had worked. The person who answered said Kobe would be glad to hear it, and Robert said please tell him thank you, and the person said he would. And the call ended, and Robert stood in the room in Culver City and understood that the transaction was complete in the specific sense that the best transactions are complete, not because both parties had received something of equivalent value, but because both parties had given something that could not be taken back, and that had changed the world by the amount that it had changed. The story became known in 2011 through a journalist who had been working on a piece about Kobe Bryant's activities outside basketball, and who had been told about it by the director of the foundation that had arranged the housing placement, who mentioned it in the context of a larger conversation about the foundation's work, and who confirmed it with the foundation's records. The journalist found Robert through the employment records, and Robert agreed to speak because enough time had passed that the privacy he had needed in the immediate aftermath was no longer the thing most in need of protection, and because the story, in his assessment, was not primarily about him or about Kobe, but about the wallet and what the wallet had revealed about both of them. About a man who found something that did not belong to him and returned it, because returning it was the last available evidence of who he still was. And about another man who received it and understood that evidence completely and responded to it in the only way that complete understanding requires. Kobe Bryant declined to be interviewed for the piece. His representative confirmed the account and said he was glad Robert was doing well and declined further comment. The journalist put that confirmation at the end of the article, and it functioned there the way it functioned in the parking structure and the restaurant and the 2 phone calls, as the action of someone who does not require the story to be told in order to have done what the story describes, who does the thing because the thing is what the situation requires, and who leaves the telling to the people for whom telling is part of the completing, which in this case was Robert, standing in the room in Culver City on the first night, calling his daughter in Phoenix, saying, "I have something to tell you," saying it is getting better, meaning it completely, for the first time in 14 months,